We're here, of course, to talk about the last 7 days, the last week of this campaign, and bring Eric into the discussion. Can you lay out for us right now where things stand?
Well, they still stand very close between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The change for those two parties is that their support is both dropping. Polls are now regularly showing both the Liberals and the Conservatives below 33% support, which would be a pretty historic thing if the two major parties together can't cobble together 2/3 of the vote. Up to this weekend, we were seeing the big story, I think, was the gains that Yves-François Blanchet and the Bloc Québécois was making in Quebec, and that was whittling away the Liberal seat advantage that they were holding earlier on in the campaign. Now, I think the story, what's developing now, is the gains for the NDP. Now we're starting to see much better numbers for Singh now in the 18, 19, 20% range. So more or less where they were in the last election, with not as much support in Quebec, but that means that they have more support in the rest of the country. So that is changing things in that the Liberals are losing some of the seats that they're expecting to gain in Quebec because of the Bloc, and outside, the NDP is starting to put a lot of pressure on them in the urban centres of the country.
Brad, I want to go straight back to you and check in with you about the NDP and what you think is behind that. We have seen momentum throughout the campaign, a very strong debate performance. It's probably hard to attribute it to one single thing, but right. What do you think is behind that?
Well, if you had to find one or two things to isolate as to what's at play here, I think there's a genuine attractiveness to Jagmeet Singh's leadership. We've talked on this panel, on multiple occasions, and particularly at the English language debate last Monday. The key for Mr. Singh was to allow that authenticity to shine through, and I think it did so in the French as well as in the English language debate. And people are attracted to that. There is a vacuum of leadership. Mr. Singh is filling that, and people are saying, I do have a choice in this election campaign. I don't have to vote out of fear. I can vote, in fact, for something. I just went to see Jagmeet Singh speak at Andrew Cash's office mini rally just yesterday, and his message was very clear. You don't have to vote out of fear. You don't have, if Mr. Trudeau is now coming back to you begging for your vote again, remind him that he promised that in 2015 that would be the last election under first past the post. He broke that promise, and now he's coming back to non-conservatives saying, "Oh my goodness, we have to unite to stop Mr. Scheer." That is nonsense. It's the only play. It's lazy liberal politics, and I hope that smart people who are non-conservatives say, you know what, I'm going to vote for something that I want, as opposed to voting out of fear this time, and I'm going to go with the NDP and Jagmeet Singh.
It's always so hard to figure out what you're thinking, Brad. Supriya, what do you think? I saw you smile there as Brad mentioned the electoral reform.
Yeah. So on the electoral reform front, I understand why the NDP is pissed, and I understand why a lot of advocates and activists are pissed. Your average voter does not care about electoral reform, and I mean, the NDP obviously knows this. Otherwise, Mr. Singh himself would have listed it in his 6 priorities when he's, if should he hold the balance of power, and should there be, a voice for the NDP at the table on this.
I think they're just saying it's ironic, though, right?
Yes.
Like if the messaging from the Liberals right now is you have to vote us or else you're going to get the Conservatives in, there's a certain level of irony there, considering that they had the chance to change the system so that wouldn't end up being the eventuality.
So I'm not exactly, but I do get your point on that front, and I mean, but that is the name of the game, and I mean, here in Ontario, the NDP was making that pitch to progressives as well, as to in order to help beat out Ford, what we needed to do was to have a lot of progressives shift their vote to the party that had a chance of actually governing, and that was in fact the NDP. And I know a number of progressives obviously shifted their vote, which is why the Liberals in Ontario only had 7 seats after the election here.
What do you think the implications are for the other parties?
It's really interesting. I mean, both of the major parties are coming down. The Bloc's going up in Quebec. The NDP, of course, are on the rise. We could end up with a really interesting result on Election Day, where both of the major parties have a relatively low percentage of the popular vote, a relatively low number of seats. No one's close to a majority. And then what happens there and who declares victory at that point? So, I mean, look, Mr. Singh has run a great campaign. We were talking about him earlier. I think his numbers are reflecting the fact that people find him the most likable leader. He's clearly the one most comfortable in his own skin, and I think that's being reflected in the numbers now. Whether that turns into much better numbers for the NDP, I think remains to be seen. But it's still going to come down to how the parties do in Ontario, how they do in Quebec. That's where 2/3 of the seats are. So who knows? We could see some real shifts in the last week, which is pretty exciting.
Eric, when you look at Ontario and Quebec right now, which from the beginning we, of course, as Rachel mentions, have been zeroing in on as key battlegrounds, what are you seeing in both those provinces?
Well, we're still seeing that the Liberals tend to have a lead in Ontario. It has, again, both the Conservatives and the Liberals seem to be coming down, so the NDP does make some gains, but it hasn't cost the Liberals their lead in Ontario, at least. It might have cost them maybe their big lead that they were having earlier on in the campaign. So that does mean that more seats are then up for grabs for the Conservatives in the GTA. Whereas in Quebec, I mean, it's just the Bloc has been picking up more or less a point a day, sort of like the NDP did back in 2011 in that province. So we'll see whether they reach a ceiling, because I think that because the Bloc Québécois is still a sovereignist party, that it does have maybe a bit more of a ceiling than perhaps the NDP would have in 2011, so we'll see if they reach that. But it is costing the Liberals now some potential seats. Before we were talking about gains that the Conservatives and the Liberals were going to make in Quebec. Now I think it's about what they can prevent from being lost to the Bloc. The NDP maybe now in a bit of a better position to hold on to a couple of the seats that they were hoping to win, but it's really just throwing up everything that we had been expecting to happen. It's just throwing up a whole bunch of dice.
It's like campaigns matter. Supriya, what do you attribute the Bloc's increase in popularity to?
I think, honestly, the leader, Mr. Blanchette, is quite charming. I think anybody who watched the French debate saw him perform extremely well in his first language. I think he's also touching on something with Quebecers when it comes to Bill 21 and, you know, Quebec c'est nous, and really just going out there and bringing home the message that in Ottawa, Quebecers' needs aren't necessarily being heard, and he will be, a very good voice for Quebec at the table. But I think the Bloc's rise also raises an interesting point in that it lets the Liberals open up with the message that they're the only true progressive federalist party out there right now that has a chance of stopping a resurgence in any sort of sovereignty movement right now. And I think people that are looking at the NDP now, that are progressive voters and that are looking at Mr. Singh's, the fact that he is quite likable and the fact that he seems like a leader that is, as Rachel said, is comfortable in his own skin, may take a second look at the NDP's own policies when it comes to courting, soft nationalist votes and even the Sherbrooke Declaration.
Brad, you know what it's like intimately to see a wave take over Quebec. Does this look similar to what you saw in 2011, and what might prevent it from being so?
Right. Well, the last 7 days here are going to be very important to keep that momentum going, and to hope that it doesn't plateau, but. It's better to be on the upswing in the last 7 days than it is on the on the downswing. I've enjoyed both, and I tell you, I prefer the upswing. But Jagmeet Singh's got to just keep focused on what has gotten him that second and third looks to begin with, and that is that genuine, authentic personality, as well as running on things that people care about, and talking about that hopeful message that he's bringing versus that fear campaign. Be fearless and vote for what you want this time. Now, in terms of where that will go and how the seats, like what we see today and what Eric is talking about today, this is basically just, I would say, it's a couple days old. One thing that I've learned in the time at central campaigns at the federal level is that when you're on the ground door knocking or at events with candidates, you're picking up the mood of the country in real time.
Right.
What the pollsters do is, and all different methodologies, and I'll leave them to describe what's the better business case, but those are a few days behind us. So what you're seeing today in the polls is what the mood was maybe by Thursday, especially if we're aggregating them, or if we're doing those 3-night rollovers that some of the pollsters do. But that momentum, where you see it on the ground, better turnout for your events. Jagmeet Singh's got a big event today in Surrey. I would assume big numbers there. There's a lot of seats south of the Fraser River there for the NDP to pick up. But this momentum keeps ticking. I would keep looking for those those personal leader numbers, the approval numbers are going up, his disapproval numbers are coming down, and the lag, as we've talked many times on this panel, the lag is actually in the horse race numbers. So I'm predicting that those horse race numbers that we saw with the upswing will continue to grow in the final. Where will it end? We don't know. We'll come back next weekend. We'll check in then.
Yeah, so I think Brad made a really important point here. We have moved now into the phase of the campaign where all the parties are getting out their vote. And the Conservatives and the Liberals have a clear advantage on that front. They have the organizational capacity and the resources to actually get out their supporters to the polls. The NDP lags behind a fair way in that. So I think we have to account for that too. The NDP may be doing very well in the polls now, but what counts is getting your supporters, getting your voters out.
What about the Bloc's capacity to do that in Quebec? What's your impression of that, Rachel?
Yeah, I don't know much about the Bloc's organizational capacity, but they have only recently started to pick up support. They've been sort of like a non-entity for a while. I can't imagine that they have the institutional resources and the memory to really do a good job of that. But, you know, Quebec's a different ballgame.
I would just say that really quickly, though, is that they can rely a little bit on CAC support too, right? So I mean,
as they have been, they've been tapping into it quite a bit.
Yeah,
very good point, Eric.
Well, I was just going to say, in the past, the Bloc Québécois was able to rely on the apparatus of the Parti Québécois to help them get that vote out. But the PQ is not very strong right now in Quebec. It only won 9 or 10 seats in the last provincial election. So even that apparatus isn't there. And where the PQ has some strength, as they had in the last provincial election, is not exactly where the Bloc is trying to get it out. So while they can tap into that, they can tap into that CAQ support. CAQ is not providing its organization to the Bloc Québécois.
Not that we know, anyway. Just kidding.